Hello, welcome to Very IT. My name is Prabdeep Singh Mann and I'm the founder and lead instructor at Very IT. In this session, we're going to cover 7 main different topics. Firstly, we'll be introducing the class, object, properties and methods. We'll then run over to a demonstration to build upon that as well. We'll be taking a further look into the parameter types and what we need from them, and then we'll follow up with 4 remaining commandlets. They include the where-object, the select-object, the sort-object, and lastly the export-CSV. Now, if you can do a great favor by hitting that like, subscribe, and hitting that bell notification, that'll be greatly appreciated. Many thanks. Here, we'll be looking at the class, object, properties, and methods. So let's start with the class. A real-life example of class is this one here, system.serviceProcess.ServiceController. Now, a class will consist of a number of things within PowerShell, but just for simplicity, we're going to say that it contains an object, which is pretty much everything within PowerShell. However, it also consists of property and methods. There are others, but for the purpose of this session, we're just going to restrict it down to the property and the method. Now, the property will have attributes. They can be things such as the make, the color, the size. It also contains methods. They are actions. It could be something like start, stop. Let's take a very basic example. We could, for instance, have 2 mobile phones. Now, if we were to break it down in terms of the object, the property and method for that class, we would say that the class is the mobile phone. The property could be the make. Now, each of those 2 mobile phones could have could be attributed to a make, and each of those 2 phones will have a specific method. Let's say that the 2 mobile phones belong to a class called mobile phone. They also have a make as well, and they have a method as well. So they can have the same class, namely a mobile phone, but they have different values for the same property and method. To break that down a little bit more, let's say we do have those 2 mobile phones. They're different, but they irrespective do belong to the class mobile phones. The property, i.e. the make of those phones, even though they both do have the property called make, they will be different values. It could be a Samsung and an iPhone, for instance. Again, with the methods, let's say, for example, they share the same method of a start time to switch on. One could be 2 seconds, the other one could be 3 seconds, for example. I'm just making these numbers out of at the moment. So moving over to a real life one. Within PowerShell, we do have a class called the system.serviceProcess.ServiceController, and these are going to be for service objects. So if we were to go to the get-service and we look at the objects for that, we're going to find that over here. We just scroll a little bit higher up. We can see that the get-service does belong to the system.serviceProcess.ServiceController class. And within that object, you do have properties. Now, this top row over here, the status, the name, the display name, that is what we would class as the property. And those values underneath will essentially be the values over here. So as an example, if we were to look for the spooler, is going to be over here. You can see that the name is going to be spooler and the display name for that is going to be print spooler. Similarly, if we were to look at the Windows update as well, we can see that the name is going to be the WA user V and the Windows update is going to be the display name. Now, whilst they have different values, they share the same properties, namely the status, name, and display name. And that's in relation to properties. And in relation to the method, they'll both have the start with the parentheses and the stop with the parentheses. Here we'll be looking at the demonstration around the class, object, properties, and methods. So for this demonstration, we're going to be discussing the class, object, properties, and method. So let's start off with our commandlet, the get-service. And press the tab button. And this will essentially list a number of services that are running locally on the device. Now, in order to get the respective member type for them, we're going to pipe that into the get-member. So let's do that. We're going to do the second one over here, which is get-service. And we're going to pipe that into the get-member. So this will have an output, and that will feed the output into input for the get-member. You can press enter. This will return the following output. Now, before we begin, this will have a class, which is namely the system.service_process.serviceController. That is what we refer to as the class, as mentioned over here. Now, within here, you're going to have a number of different columns. We have the name, member type, and the definition. The member type will be a number of different ones. They include the alias, event, script method, but for the purpose of this session, we're looking at the method and the property. If we look at the property, you can see it does have the display name and the machine name. So you can see over here for the display name and the machine name over here, and they refer to the property, which is this one over here. And each of those will also have a respective string, and a string is a collection of text. But we'll go into that in more detail in due course. You also notice that they do have methods. They have a start and a stop. So if you look over here, there is a start method, there is a stop method. They also have a start with a parentheses and a stop with parentheses. We move over to our second commandlet, which is the get-LocalUser. So this will outline a number of all the local users that are on my device. If I do get-LocalUser and run this commandlet, you can see it has a list of all the respective local users. Once again, if I want to get the member type for this commandlet, I'm going to pipe that into get-member. So if I were to do that, get-LocalUser, I'm going to pipe that into get-member. And like before, this will now have a separate class. This will be the Microsoft.PowerShell.command.LocalUser. And that in turn will have three separate columns: the name, the member type, and the definition. As before, the member type does have method and properties. And if we look at the properties, we can see that it has the account expired and the description as over here, as well as the method, which does have the get type and the toString, as shown below over here. And that's a breakdown of the class, the object, the properties, and the methods. Here we'll be looking at the parameter types and what we need. To reinforce it, we're going to run through another demonstration. So as mentioned before, each class will have a respective object, and objects will consist of the property as well as method. And what is attached to an object is the property, and the property will have a respective data type. Now those data types can vary. They can include things such as integers, which we refer to as numbers, characters, which could be things such as letters like A, B, C, all the way to Z. We also have string, which are a series of text. And lastly, it can include things such as Boolean, which could be true, false. We also have these dollar signs, but we'll cover that in due course. Now, if we were to run the commandlet get-service, again, this will show the services that are running locally on the device. Now, within that, we're going to also get the member types for that respective object. So as before, we're going to run the get-service. That will then be piped into get-member. And like before, this will belong to a specific class, namely the system.serviceProcess.serviceController. Now, if we were to break this down, as mentioned before with the class, that has an object which has the properties and methods. We already know that that class is going to be the system.serviceProcess.serviceController. This will then have the object which we class as get-service. We'll call that the service object. And then the property are going to be these ones over here where the member type is the property. And we know that it contains the service name and the display name. And we can see that's the case over here. We've got the service name over here. And we also have the display name, which is over here. And as you can see, they belong to the member type property. They also have a string as well, but we'll discuss that in due course. Furthermore, you do have a method. This one over here. They have the start method and the stop method. And as before, they do have a parentheses with the start with the parentheses and the stop with the parentheses. Hopefully, that just reinforces our understanding of the class, object, properties, and members. So for this demo, we're going to be looking at the get-service parameter types. Now, if we were to go into Google and search for get-service for PowerShell, it will have a number of different methods in terms of retrieving information. So the first one is that you can do get-service with a name and a string. That'll then be followed by method 2, which is get-service with a display name and a string. And then lastly, you do have a get-service whereby you're inputting an object from the service controller. Now we'll run through all three different methods. So firstly, we've got the get-service. I'm just going to run that as before. As you can see, this will return all the services that are running within our local device. Now, if we want to follow this specific output over here, where it's got the name and the string, what we'd essentially do, let's say for instance, we're going to be taking the app info, then what we would essentially do is run the get-service, whereby the name, which is this one over here, is going to have the string, namely the app info, which falls under the name. Similarly, if we want to run the second one, which is a get-service with display name and the string, we would run the commandlet get-service, and then we would have the dash display name, which is going to be this one over here. But also it's going to instead have app info, it would have the string application information. Let's run through those two now in a moment. We've already discussed this earlier in the previous video. So if we run this one, first one, which is get-service with the name and the string app info. Get-service, where the name is going to be app info. You can see that it filters the service out, the get-service output specifically to the app info for its name. Similarly, we can do the same as before, but we're going to filter it based upon the display name of application information. So we're going to run the second one over here to follow the same format of retrieving this. So it's going to be get-service, where the display name is going to have, we're going to use the inverted commas or the quotes, and we're going to use it because it's on a string, and we call that the application information. And as you can see, it does filter the get-service specifically for the application information, or alternatively the app info, depending on which script we run. Now there is a third method, which is whereby you have the get-service, but it makes reference to the object. And with this one, it does require a little bit more understanding for it, which we will cover in due course, and we'll show that at a later stage. In this demonstration, we're going to be looking at the parameters that we need in relation to get-LocalUser. Now, the commandlet we're going to be using, as mentioned, is get-LocalUser. So just run that as a reminder. And this outlines all the respective local users associated with my device. Now, there are two main methods that you can use in relation to retrieving the local user. Now, if we were to search for this in Google in terms of the get-LocalUser PowerShell and search for those terms within Google Chrome, it will retrieve that there are two methods that you can use in order to obtain this. Method one is where you can have the get-LocalUser followed with the dash name and an associated string with it. Alternatively, method number two is where you are going to use the command get-LocalUser, but it's also going to be using the -SID, namely the security identifier, which we need to obtain. So what we're going to do is filter this list down whereby we can obtain the administrator. Now, following the main method number one, which is what we've done in the past, you would normally run the get-LocalUser. The name is going to be this column over here, as shown. And the string would essentially be the administrator, namely the one below it as well. So let's run through that now. So we're going to do get-LocalUser. We're going to be using that commandlet. The parameter is going to be name, as over here, and the value is going to be the administrator. And as before, strings will always have the quote. So we're going to put the quote administrator, quote again. And you should find that the output that's going to be retrieved is going to be filtered down to the administrator, as expected. Now, if you were to do the second method, which was to do the get-LocalUser commandlet followed by the -SID, named the security identifier, and we've got to populate it with the security identifier, then that should filter it down. Let's run through it logically. So if we were to do the get-LocalUser again, and then run the parameter SID. Now, if we were to look above, we don't have a security identifier within the get-LocalUser, which means we can't complete this. So the question is, how do we actually obtain that? So if we were just to press enter, just so we can get an error for now, just to clear out from that. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the get-LocalUser. And we're going to essentially pipe that into the get-member. Now, when we do so, this, as before, will belong to the class, as mentioned, the Microsoft.PowerShell.commands.localUser. It does have the columns for name, member type, and definition. But the main thing we want to look at is seeing if there is a security identifier. And as mentioned, there is a SID, which has the property, namely a security identifier. So the question is, as before, we do have the get-LocalUser with the -SID, but we don't know what the security identifier is for the administrator. And in order to do so, what we're going to do is format that list. Now, the format list will display the output in a more detailed manner. Let's do that. So we're going to run this commandlet over get-LocalUser, and we're going to type that into a format list. We do the format -list, and this is going to essentially display this entire thing into a list format, but with more detail. So when we do so, you can now see it does have the get-LocalUser, but in a list format. But the great thing is it does contain more information, and most importantly, it does contain the SID, which is a security identifier. This now in turn means we can run this script over here, which is get-LocalUser, the -SID security identifier, and we do have it over here. So let's just quickly copy that security identifier over here. And we're going to now in turn run the script. So get-LocalUser commandlet, the parameter is going to be the SID. And just pay specific attention. It doesn't mention that it is a string like above, so we don't need to put the quotations in place. So when we paste our security identifier, hopefully that get-local-user list will be filtered down to the administrator. So when we do so, as expected, it does filter the get-local-user specifically to the administrator. And that's another example of how you use parameters with the get-local-user. Here we'll be looking at the where-object commandlet. In this demonstration, we're going to be looking at the where-object to filter on the properties. So as before, we're going to start off with our commandlet, the get-service, to retrieve all the services that are running locally on my device. When we start off with that, as you can see, this will outline as before the status, the name, and the display name. As before, if we wanted to filter it on, let's say, for example, the remote service, which is going to be this one over here, remote access, apologies. What we would normally do is run the get-service followed by the parameter, which is going to be the name, and then that will then be followed by the value, namely the remote-access. So to do that, we're going to just run this script over here as before. That's get-service as our commandlet. We're then going to run the parameter, which is name, and the value as before would be in a string, which is remote access. And given that it is a string, we're going to have quotes on them. So that will filter the list down of get service specifically to remote access. However, if we want to be using the where-object commandlet, then it's going to be structured a little bit differently. Now you can't start off with the where-object. This is generally used as part of a pipeline. So this one over here specifically, you're going to have the where-object after the pipeline. So you'd start off with a get-service. That would essentially have an output as before over here. That then in turn will be piped into where-object. And that in turn will have this text over here. Now this will have a curly bracket. We have the dollar, which will explain due course, and this will also have the PS item. Now the PS item is essentially a placeholder, and it's essentially what this output is. It would use it as a placeholder. You then have the dot name, which is what value you are searching for, and the EQ stands for equal, and then you want to essentially look for your value remote access, and that will then in turn be in a quote, given that it is a string, and that will be closed with some curly brackets. Just bear in mind that it doesn't return an error message, so just be careful when you are running this as well. So let's run through this. If we were to start with a get-service commandlet, we're then going to pipe that into the where-object. And that in turn will have the curly brackets. We're going to use a $sign, and we're going to have the PS item. That in turn, we're going to filter this based on the name, which is going to be here. And that is going to equal, and we're going to be looking for the string remote access. As we know, this is the one over here. And we're going to finally finish it off with a curly bracket. So what this is essentially doing is obtaining a list of services. Is then going to pipe that into where-object, and you're going to use all that and pipe it into the and put that into the PS item, which is our placeholder. We're then going to be searching for everything where the name is equal to the remote access, and that should filter it down. So if we were to run this, that in turn provides the same output where it's filtering the get-service by searching for the object remote access. And again, we can apply it for different purposes. Let's say, for instance, we want to look at all the services that are running and which one has a status whereby it has stopped. So essentially what we're doing is we're looking for a status over here and anything that has essentially stopped. So if we were to run the second one over here, so again, let's run through that, get dash service, a list of all the services. And we're going to pipe that into where dash object. And that in turn will have the curly open brackets. We're going to put it into a placeholder. We're going to do the $PS item. And we're going to be searching for the status. And we're going to be searching for the value whereby it equals anything that is stopped. And as before, it's going to be a string. So we're going to be looking for stopped and not stopping. Just bear in mind, you do often have running, but it's not stopping, it's stopped. That in turn will now be closed with a curly bracket. And again, this should essentially list all the services whereby the status is showing stopped. So as you can see, this has a list of all the respective services where everything is stopped as expected. And now let's say we want to, for instance, output that into a text file in our C folder, and I've created a folder called labs. So if I were to go into my file explorer, go to lab, essentially what I've done is I've created a folder on my C drive called lab. As you can see, there's nothing in there. So again, if I were to run the above, I'm just going to just press my up cursor arrow just to speed things up a bit. If I can't find it, I'll end up just typing it in a moment. So it's where dash object. I'm going to use the open curly brackets. Apologies, get dash service. First, we're going to start off with that. We're going to pipe that into where dash object. That's going to retrieve a list of all the respective services. And that's going to be fed into our placeholder, PS item. And again, as before, we're going to be looking at anything whereby the status is equal to the status which is stopped. That in turn will have the closed curly brackets. But as before, we're going to now use the out file so we can pipe that into a text file. And that's going to go to out-file. And it's going to be going to the file path, whereby it is C:, and it's \lab. And we're going to be calling it services stopped. We'll make it a text file. And that should be it. So as you can see, I don't necessarily have any files in here yet. So if I was to run this and bring this over, you can see that now there is a text file called services stopped. If I was to open this, this in turn will open up a file. Bear with me for a moment while I just get that. Bear with me. As you can see, it's over here. So that's essentially a demonstration where we are looking at where dash object, and that is to filter properties on certain commandlets. Here, we're going to be running another demonstration of the where-object to filter properties. The two examples we're going to be running through is listing users that are enabled to update the description to enabled. We're then going to find a list of users that are disabled and update the description to disabled. So in order to do so, we're going to firstly run through our regular commandlet. To start off, we'll build it up, the get-LocalUser. And when we do so, as before, it does have a list of all the respective users, namely the enabled as well as the disabled. Now, there's no enabled parameter when we want to look at which ones are enabled and disabled. So if we were, for example, to do get-LocalUser and we run enabled, it doesn't actually have that here. So we can't essentially use the dash enabled at all. So in that scenario, we'll then have to use the where-object. So what we're going to do is use this script over here, and I'll explain it as before. So we're going to run the get-LocalUser, going to pipe that into where-object, and then we're going to use the open curly brackets, and we're going to be searching for our placeholder item, the ps-item, so ps item. We're then going to look at where all the enabled statuses are reflecting. And we want to make sure that it is equal to anything whereby it is true. So using $true. We're going to close it with our curly brackets. So this is essentially going to get a retrieval of all the respective local users. And it's going to put a condition where the object, which we're going to put into the placeholder, is enabled. So it's going to search for anything that's enabled in here and filter it down on anything that's true. So it should return anything here within the local users whereby the account is enabled. So if we're to run that, you can see it has now returned an output and retrieved anything that has an account that is enabled. We can run the same thing again, but this time we're going to be searching for anything that has been disabled. So if we were to repeat the above, but this time we're going to be putting the description of disabled. So I actually change that to $false, sorry. So essentially we're looking for anything whereby the account is not enabled and the value should be set to false. And as you can see, it's returned all the respective local users, but instead of them being enabled, they are disabled this time. That's the second script. The third script is to essentially update the description of all the respective enabled users. And what we'll do is we'll call them as enabled accounts with an S. So we can distinguish them, as I've already written them as enabled account and disable account. So we're going to add an S to them. So as before, we are going to run third script where we're going to obtain a list of all the enabled users that are going to be with a description of enabled accounts. Let's run through that. So get-local-user. That in turn, we're going to pipe into the where-object. That in turn will have an open curly bracket, and we're going to put it into the placeholder of the $PS item. And we want to search for the parameter enabled, where the value is going to be true as before. $true. That will be closed with the curly brackets. We're then going to pipe that into that has an output. Set-local-user, whereby it has a description. And we want to set those description to enabled accounts with an S on them. Now, if we were to run this, it won't necessarily provide a output. So what we can do is search for Get-LocalUser, and you can see it. Anything that is essentially enabled will have accounts with an S on them. If we were to repeat the above, but this time we're going to change the enabled accounts to false and make sure that the description is set to disabled accounts with an S. So that is going to be this one over here. If we were to run this one, so as before, what we've essentially done is change the enabled status, as instead of it being true, we're making it that it's false. So we're going to search for anything that's false. And then instead of having the description enabled accounts, we're going to change it to disabled accounts. Currently it's got disabled account. We're going to have disabled account with an S at the end. So if we were to run this one over here, and now we look at the get-local-users again, you now see that anything that's disabled is outlined with an S at the end of it. And now there's another way we can also search for it. So for instance, rather than doing get-local-user, if you want to filter it down as we were discussed earlier, you can go through this method as well through the where-object. So we're going to be filtering it based on anything whereby the account has a description that has enabled accounts with the S on there and disabled accounts with an S on there as well. So to do so, we're going to run the first script. And it's the get-local-user. I'm going to pipe that into where-object. And have the open curly brackets. The dollar as the PS item, our placeholder. We're going to be searching for the parameter description here. And we're going to be looking for the value enabled accounts. I'm going to close it with the curly brackets. And as you can see, it's essentially brought down a list and retrieved it with whereby the accounts that are enabled do have the description enabled accounts with an S on there. And we're going to repeat the same, but this time we're going to be looking for anything with disabled accounts, whereby we're going to be running this script above. To save time, I'm just going to copy this. And the only difference is now we're going to be looking for anything with disabled accounts. We have to run this one now. You can see it's retrieved anything whereby the accounts are essentially disabled. And this is another demonstration whereby we're using the where-object to filter on properties. Here, we'll be looking at the select-object commandlet. Now bear in mind, this is specifically used to change the output or view on the screen. Not good practice to use this as a filter. Now there are a number of scripts that we can run through. So if we were to look at the get-local-user as before, this will outline a number of respective local accounts on my device. Now, if I wanted to filter this essentially based upon the first three or the last three, I would have to use the select-object commandlet. Now, this is generally used after a pipeline, so you can't use it at the very beginning because it's essentially going to be selecting it based on the input that you've provided when you are retrieving it from a get-commandlet, for instance. So let's run the first script, which is get-local-user as before. But this time what we're going to do is pipe that into select-object. And what we're going to do is select how far down we want to go in the list. So let's say we want to pick the first 3. So we'd put the first and we put 3 as the integer. Now, if we were to run that, this will in turn return the following output, whereby it's changed the output or the view that's within our PowerShell. That being said, we can repeat the same as above, but we can look at the last 3. So if I were to then repeat this, but change it to the last 3, we would just essentially replace the first with last. Do that. You can now see that it has generated an output whereby it shows the last 3. Second script. The third script is going to essentially be whereby we're filtering it based on the name and the description of the first 3. So let's say we were to repeat this again. So we're going to do the get-LocalUser. We're going to pipe that into our select-object. And we're going to be looking at the property. We're going to run this one. And whereby we've essentially got the name enabled and description, what we're going to do is just purely filter it to we'll change the view, apologies, to the first column, specifically to the name. So we're going to have the property name, and we're going to pick the first 3. That's properly. And as you can see, it's changed the view from where it has 3 columns. It's only going to have the first column over here. As before, we can also include the description simply by repeating the above. But whereby I had the property just specifically for name, I can also include description. And as you can see now, it has 2 columns over here. It shows the name and the description. And in turn, if I wanted to output that into a specific file, let's call it local user list, I would essentially repeat this one over here. We're going to be running this one over here. I'm going to repeat it, but this time I'm going to pipe it into the out-file, and I'm going to present it to the following file path, which again we mentioned is in my file explorer, namely the C labs folder. And I'm going to do it to the file path C:// and we're going to be using lab, and it will be called local user list, and we'll put it in a txt file, and we're going to close that with the quotation. And upon us doing that, you can now see that does in fact return a output of local user list in text format, and in turn it does show the following output over here, namely the top 3 that are associated with the local user accounts. And that's essentially how you use the select-object to change the output and view, but it's not necessarily a filter. Here we'll be looking at the sort-object commandlet. Here we'll be looking at the sort-object commandlet. Now this will essentially change the order of objects displayed. It could be in alphabetical order, it could be ascending or descending. So if we were to start off with our commandlet as before, get-service, you can see it has a list of all the services that are running currently on my device. Now as you can see over here, it is in alphabetical order. So what we're going to do is go to descending so we can actually change it from Z to A, if that makes sense. What we're going to do is run the second script, which is get-service, and we're going to pipe it into our commandlet sort-object. Now, when we do that, we'll need to specify as to how we want to specifically sort it. So we're going to have the property, which is going to essentially be the name, this one over here. And we're going to specify that it needs to be in a descending order. And upon us doing that, you'll see that all the services associated with it are going to be in a descending order. So you can see it starts from the highest letter, namely with Z, going all the way down to A. And if I wanted to also output that into a file, namely a text file, what I would essentially do is repeat that. But this time I'm just going to pipe that into the out dash file. And I'm going to specify it's got to be in a file path whereby it goes onto the C drive in my lab folder, and it's going to be a file called sort object. And what we'll do, we'll make it a txt file. And if I were to go to my file explorer, namely this one over here, you can see it's got sort object. And if I were to open that, you can see now in turn it's output all the services in a descending order in a text file saved on my C lab folder. So that's a quick demonstration of how to use the sort object commandlet. Here we'll be looking at the Export-CSV Cmdlet. Now, as you can see over here, we have the get-service commandlet as usual, which is get-service. As mentioned before, this shows a number of all the services that are running locally on my device. Now, what I would like to do is export this entire output into a CSV. So in order to do so, we're going to run our second script. Now, what it is you're going to be using the get-service as before, but we're going to pipe that into our commandlet export-CSV. And what we have to do is specify a path. So we're going to use the dash path. And we're going to ensure that it's going to be in our quote, the C:\lab folder as before. Just to specify that it's going to be this one over here. And we're going to specify that it's called CSV. And what we'll do is we'll put it in a CSV format. Yeah. And if we were to run that, you'd find that it does in fact open up a CSV file over here. If we were to open this, this in turn will provide the following output over here. Now, as you can see on this output, it does have quite a lot of information over here. So if I want to actually filter it down a little bit more with certain columns, then all I would essentially do is to specify before I use the pipe into the export CSV, specifies what I'm after from a column perspective. So that's namely this one over here. Let's say, for instance, that I want to pick specifically the status and the name. In order to do so, we're going to repeat the above. However, we're going to specify before the export CSV as to what objects I want to select. As per our earlier session, we would use the select dash object. And we're going to search for the property. Whereby we're looking for the status and the name. And we're going to pipe that into the export CSV. So if I were to do this in turn now, we'll call it CSV1, sorry. And now if I go back to my file explorer, you can see there's a CSV1. And this time round, it will now have the respective columns as specified, namely the status and the name, as opposed to from before, which is the one with more columns. So you can see we do have one here. We have one over here. This one has fewer columns, and this one has all the respective columns. So in summary, we've covered the output in a CSV, namely the Export-CSV Cmdlet. Hopefully you found that session really useful. If you can do a great favor by hitting that like, subscribe, and hitting that bell notification, that would be greatly appreciated. Bye for now.